I recently built this directory using Baserow and Webstudio. So Baserow holds all the data and Webstudio is fetching that data and displaying it, and it's complete with filters so the user can come in here and select what they want to see and filter the content. And I'm going to show you how to build this. We're going to break it down into 6 different steps. Before we actually start building, I'm going to talk about why I chose Baserow over Airtable. I actually started with Airtable, ran into some things, and I'll share those. Then we're going to start building and fetch the data. So in Webstudio, we are going to make an API call to Baserow and get our data. Once we have that data, we are going to bind it or map it to the different components in Webstudio. So if we have a title column in Baserow, we're going to say we want that title to display on our header over here. Once we're done doing that, we're going to create filters, which are essentially just a form. After we have that, we need to use the form submission values in our API call. And finally, I'm going to show you how to create a sitemap and have an individual page per record if you want to do that. It might sound like a lot, but we're going to break it down step by step. And there's actually a marketplace template that's going to expedite this too. Let's first go over why I chose Baserow over Airtable. I actually started with Airtable. I like the UX there and I'm just familiar with the platform, but I ran into 2 limitations and then I discovered some other things about Baserow that made it a solid choice for building this directory. One of the problems I had with Airtable is that when a filter is unchecked, they are not ignoring that value. They're actually trying to find this data. And let's look at what's happening here. It's okay if you've never used variables or resources. We're going to go into all of this. I'm looking for a category that matches this input. Again, don't worry if you don't understand this. And what's happening is that input's not checked, so it prints out undefined. Airtable is literally looking in my table for a value that says undefined, when in fact, I just don't want them to use this filter at all. We can combat this by putting if conditions in there and saying if this checkbox is checked, then output the value. But once you start using 2+ filters, it's going to become pretty hard to maintain. On top of that, Airtable uses these and conditions. When you have 5 different filters that all need to have if statements saying if the filter exists, then output it, and combine that with putting them inside these and conditions or statements, it's going to become extremely hard to maintain. And I'll just demo this on Airtable too. If I check it and search it, we're going to find our products matching electronics, and we can see that electronics outputs right here. Baserow, on the other hand, will ignore the value if it's undefined. So if I go to my resource here, I can see that there are a bunch of undefined values outputting, and Baserow is just ignoring them altogether. If I decide to check these, then they'll start using those values. Additionally, Baserow makes it really easy to tack on additional filters without having to nest them all into these and conditions. The last reason I chose Airtable, and this was an added benefit once I started working with their API, is they have this query builder here where you get to visually define the different filters you want, and it'll translate it to the code that you need to add to Webstudio. So this saves a lot of time when putting together filters. And those are the reasons why I chose Baserow. It being open source is an added benefit, but it really was the API that made it very nice to work with. It's time to hop into Webstudio and fetch Baserow data. I have a new project here, and I'm going to start by going to the marketplace and head over to integrations. And here I'm going to select Baserow. In this template, there are several different pages you can insert. I want to insert the directory. This is going to input a complete directory that's hooked up to our demo Baserow, but I'm going to show you how to customize it to your own Baserow. From fetching your data to customizing the filters. But right now we need to fetch your Baserow data. So now that this is inserted, I'm going to go to the navigator, and the variable here is on the page wrapper. And here I've got all of these different variables that you are able to configure. And so here's how this is working. We have this Baserow data. This is what's responsible for fetching your data. We could just create a new one. By the way, this is what's happening is it's a resource and we're calling some sort of URL, and that URL is Baserow's URL, which is going to provide us the information. But I've already configured that here. To customize it to your own, we need to swap out these ones with the settings icon. So first we need to grab a Baserow token. I'm going to go over to my Baserow here and go up to the top, and I believe it's in my settings, and here we have database tokens. Here I'm going to create a new token, and I'm just going to call this my video token so I know I can delete it later, and say this is good for Webstudio, and create it. And here I need to change the permissions. I do not want this token to do all of this. I'm actually going to turn it all off. I don't want it to be able to create data on everything and read data on everything. And just for the table I want it to be able to read from, I'm going to enable read. And this will make sure this token only has access to this table. And I'm going to go over to the three dots and click copy. And I'm going to go over to Webstudio and paste this token in. Okay, next I need to get my Baserow table ID. It's up here in the URL, but it's also somewhere else, and we're going to need to reference the API docs. So I'm going to click these three dots and say View API Docs. On the left-hand side, you'll have your own tables here. Baserow automatically gives you API docs specific to your table. Mine's called comparison table, and at the top it says the ID of this table is this. So I'm going to grab that and paste it in this field. I'm going to keep user field names off for now. I'll get into that later. And the order by field, we do need to configure that now, because if you're trying to order by a field that doesn't exist in your table, it's going to throw an error. So this is kind of jumping a step, but for right now, we just need to grab some sort of field to order by. Scrolling down, we have a list of all of our fields. We have the internal field ID and then like the human readable name. I'm using these internal IDs because it'll make it easy for us later. That was that user field options, and I'll get into that later. But for right now, just know that if you're using that, grab one of these values you want to filter by. I already have mine in there. It's called rank, and I'm going to just paste that in here. And I have a minus in front of it. That means I want to filter descending. So I want to start with the biggest rank and then filter to the smallest rank. If you wanted to go from smallest to biggest, you wouldn't use the minus sign. And items per page, you can configure this if you want more or less. And this will automatically show up if you have more items than you're allowing to show on the page. Okay, now that we've have all that, I can go to the three dots inspect, and I should just see information here. If you get an error, read it and try to figure out what went wrong. Probably one of these values is wrong. Now we've fetched the data, which means that we've taken that Baserow data and we've brought it into Webstudio. Every time our website loads, the new data is going to be fetched. So you can go to Baserow, change some content, and the next time that page loads, you are going to see your updated content. It's time to bind the data, meaning we're going to take the data that we've fetched from Baserow and map it to our Webstudio components. So here I have all of this data. For example, I've got this field and the value is ghost, and I want it to display on my cards. Now mine already looks good because I'm using the template Baserow data, but yours is hooked up to your Baserow, so it's going to show blank values. So let's back up a step. What we're doing here is we have a collection, which is a type of component. And this lets us iterate over each result in our Baserow, and it'll duplicate our design and provide a unique value for it. So let's break that down. First of all, let's open up bindings. If we go to any field, we have this plus button, and I already have one here, but I'm just going to get rid of it and go to my Baserow data. So I want to bind something from my Baserow data to this collection. So I'm going to do this by clicking period, which lets me access the child values. And in here, it's going to be located in data and results. That's Baserow's standard API structure. And if I click period one more time, I'm going to get the numbers, meaning each one of these represents an individual row in Baserow. So if I were to select 0, I would only display an error, but it's only getting that first item in Baserow. I don't want that. I want all of the results. So as soon as I get to the numbers, I'm going to back up and click out of it. Now it's going to output an individual box, link, or whatever you have in here for every single record. I'm just going to delete this to show you that. If I add heading, for example, it's going to output the heading for however many records I have. And if I were to change one heading, change the color here, it's going to change them all because it's essentially the same thing, but each one has access to a different record in Baserow. All right, I'm going to back up a couple times. So in here, you can drag in whatever design, or you can just add all your different components and then go to each component. And instead of just typing in the value here, I'm going to get rid of my binding. Instead of typing in, ASDF or whatever, I need this to be whatever this iteration, whatever record I'm on, that value. So I'm going to go up to the plus button and grab my Baserow item. This is going to represent the individual iteration I'm on, and drill down into the data. Now, because I'm using that setting from up here that says user field names false, I'm outputting the internal Baserow field names. And this makes it a pain to deal with up front, but it makes it also much more stable for the long term. What's happening, instead of just it outputting platform, which is one of my column names, it's outputting this field ID. If I don't use the internal IDs and I use the user field names, it makes it really easy So I can just go in here and say, okay, I want my Baserow item dot platform. So if I were to ever go into the column in Baserow and say, instead of platform, I'm going to call it CMS or whatever, that's going to break everything on my website because I was literally looking for platform. So we're going to put a little more work in up front to make this more stable. And by going to our API docs, I can see, okay, my platform internal name, internal ID is this. I'm going to copy that and do dot that. And I'm going to do dot again, see if there's anything else. There is, and I have a value here. Now, for each record, it's outputting the name, or the platform rather, of that record. And I can continue doing this for all the different fields. So for image, for example, I've gone and found my field ID. And in here, I do have 0 because that means the first item in here. Before I told you don't select those because on the collection, we wanted to iterate over every single one. For images, you can upload multiple attachments to Baserow. So this is just saying, do you want the first one, the second one, the third one, even if they don't exist? We want that first one, which is 0. And then here I have different information about the image. I'm going to grab the URL. And I've gone ahead and did similar things to the other fields. The only one I'll show you now before we jump into anything else is concatenating or combining some static text and dynamic text. So for the alt text, I want to say this is the platform name space logo. And the way I do that is we already know how to get ghost or just the platform name. After that, I'm going to do plus and then some quotes, and then I'm going to do a space and say logo. And so that's going to glue those two items together. We even have a count up here that's automatically going to grab the count and format it. So it'll say 1 platform or 28 platforms plural. You can go in here and change platform if you want. Finish binding your data to Webstudio, adding all the different components you want to show up, and binding those Baserow values to Webstudio. For now, I'm happy with what I've got here, so I'm going to check off the binding data step. It's time to create filters to let our visitors filter our content, provide dynamic experiences, and really give the visitor exactly what they're looking for. Heading over to Webstudio, we have a filter here, but you're going to want to modify it to be your own. So I'm going to show you how to do that and give you some tips and tricks for working with it. First, let's go over how this is actually working. Okay, so I'm on the live site right now, and ignore the fact that the data is actually going to filter because that's not going to happen until the next step. And I'm going to check both of these and click filter. Right now, I want you to pay attention to the URL. We have open source equals yes, free tier equals yes. So anytime you submit the form, the page doesn't reload, but it modifies the query parameters with whatever the submission values are. So if I also add a search here, it's going to add that exact search input right here. And that's just the default behavior of a form. So we have a form already in here, and I have a couple of input values. Any input value you create, ensure that you give it a name. So right here, I have open source, and that's what we were seeing in the URL right there. It also says equals yes. That's the value. You don't have to, you can put whatever you want there. I just want it something kind of clean rather than the default. Now in the add components, you can work with any of these inputs, giving your visitors the ability to, type things in, use a select list. The checkboxes I'm using aren't these checkboxes or radios. They are the radix ones. The reason I'm using the radix checkbox is because HTML inputs have very limited styling. It's just a limitation of HTML or CSS. And radix is saying, here's what we're going to do. We're going to hide that input that can't be styled, and we're going to provide you some custom thing that can be styled. When the visitor interacts with the custom one, behind the scenes, we're going to go modify the hidden one. So user checks the custom checkbox, radix will go check the real HTML checkbox. And that's how I was able to accomplish these. These are actually just radix checkboxes that have custom styling. I think I have 2 more things I want to point out. One of them is that on this filter button, I created a script to add here that automatically disables the submit button when it's submitting and enables it when it's done. So you can see here, we've got these dots show up, and then when the data is done filtering, it goes back to enabled. You can change the values of the default state, adding images or text in there, and the loading state, same thing, adding images or text. Last and not least, when I submit this form, you'll notice that the checked boxes stay checked. And that's because I'm doing something special. If I didn't do this thing I'm about to show you, they would all clear, which could be confusing for the visitor to understand what they have filtered or to make simple modifications to their existing filters. Here's what we're doing. First, I'm going to submit both of these values to give us some test data and also just apply search. And I'm going to go back into the builder, and on my body, there's a default system variable. And if I inspect this, we can see that there is this search property with some children, search, open source, free tier. These are all of my different field values that have been submitted. Now I have some test data to work with. So I'm going to go back over to my checkbox and show you how to do this. Unchecked, I'm going to get rid of my existing expression and say, get that system variable .search, and which field do I want? Well, I'm on open source, so grab that. And now I'm going to put a question mark, and this is basically saying, if that exists, then I want it to be checked. And then I'm going to put a colon, and anything after here is if it doesn't exist, I'm going to do false. So this just says, is open source present in the query parameter? Yes, check this, otherwise uncheck it. And that's how I'm going to provide a default state. And we can see that here. If I get rid of open source is no longer checked. And if I get rid of free tier is no longer selected. And we can do the same thing for other fields. So for text input, I've got, does the system search exist? If yes, I don't want to just output true. I want to output the exact value that has been searched for. Otherwise, just output some empty string. Okay, so now we have our form built. When we submit them, it's going to take the name of the field and put it into the URL, and the value of it and put it into the URL. The button's going to disable, and it's going to automatically keep whatever form fields were submitted in that same state when the form does submit. So if the user enters a search and submits it, their search input is still going to show. We've effectively created the filters, even though they're not doing anything yet. In the next step, we're going to talk about using the filters. Now we're going to take those submission values, the filters, and use them in our query. Heading back over to our query, I am going to modify it a bit because your filters are going to be different. And out of everything that we're doing, this is going to be the trickiest part. And I'll try to simplify it as best as possible. And actually, it's not me, Baserow is making this easy. I'm going to go up to my Baserow data resource and open the URL field expression. And here is where you would be modifying the query. I'm going to make this a bit bigger. I'm going to get rid of some information here. So everything that I've got in here so far, I just want to break this down because it's a little confusing, is, for example, Baserow table ID. When we entered this in the first step, it's getting used in here. You don't need to change it here because if you want to change your table ID, you just go over to the right. The other variables are also outputting here. Some of this is for pagination, order by, that's that variable we talked about down here. I've got the search field in here. That's going to be default for everybody's Baserow because they just have some generic search. But filters, here's where it gets special. We say filters equal, and then from here to here. These are all of the filters. For now, I'm going to get rid of this to show you how to build it from scratch. Let's build our own filters. So I'm going to go over to my API docs and say, there's a builder in here, open filters parameter builder. In here, I'm going to add all of the different checkboxes or inputs or anything I want to filter by and build this out. So for me, I have an open source column, and I want to say that this equals or is, and I'm going to give it a value. We're going to make these values dynamic in our query, but for right now, if it's a yes or no or a certain like select list item, just give it whatever the value is if the user were to check it. So if I say open source, I want it to be my value that is the checkbox. And now I'm going to do free tier. Free tier is, and same thing, these are the three different values I have. It's a select list in Baserow. Here, I'm going to copy the JSON to the clipboard. All right, now I'm going to go over to Webstudio, open up Baserow data, expand our URL query parameter. And in here, I'm going to find that filters equals, and I'm just going to paste this. And right now, if I were to close out of here, let's make sure it works. A valid integer is required. Okay, so I made a mistake and valid integer required when I believe this needs to be off. Yeah, that's my problem. As you can see, this says field and the field ID. If I turn this on, it uses open source. The problem is we are using that disabled in our query, so we just need that to match. Okay, let's copy this again. And then I'm going to find filters equals and get that first bracket to the last bracket down here right before the system search and paste this in. And now I've got a count of 0, maybe because ASDF is searched right now. Let me get rid of that. Okay, now My data is pulling in, but these filters aren't working because if you recall, we just selected everything to be checked. Now we need to make them dynamic. We need to say, okay, don't always pull in open source or always pull in free tier. Sometimes you might want to do that. If you have like a publish checkbox, then don't let the user configure that, only pull in published content. But for us, I want open source to be conditional. I want free tier to be conditional. So I'm going to go back over to my resource. I'm calling this a query. It's a resource. It's an API call, different names for it. And in here, I'm going to do two things. Filters equals, this filters right here, there's a bracket, square bracket. After that, I'm going to click enter, and these individual filters are easier to see this way. Some APIs don't like the line breaks. I found that with Baserow, it works okay, so I've just been rolling with it. But now I can see, okay, this is one filter, this is another filter. And if I want to add other ones on later, I don't even need to use the query parameter builder if I didn't want to. I just know to add a comma and then copy paste this and change out my field ID and then whatever value I want here. But for right now, let's make this dynamic. The only thing we need to make dynamic is the value. We need to say only filter by that value if the checkbox is present. So I am going to copy that. Now I'm going to do the syntax, which is $ and two brackets. And now in here, it's switching from static mode to dynamic mode. Now I can start using my variables. This is just a JavaScript syntax. And here I'm going to do that system.search that we've already accessed. And this is open source. So I'm going to grab my open source. I probably should submit the form so I have a variable to access, but because that's not checked right now, it's just not present. But I'm just going to type in open source. And like I showed you before, we can do the question mark, which means is open source in the URL? Output this. Is it not in the URL? Don't output anything. I'm going to do something a little bit more concise, and that's and, which is basically if it exists, just to do this. If it doesn't exist, I don't even need to consider that scenario. You don't need to provide anything. And the same thing for here. I'm going to copy out the value I want to use and then do $ brackets. System.search.freetier is the name of my field. And if that exists, output that ID. So now when I close out, I can see whatever that expression will output as. So if you do 2 + 2, it'll show 4 here. And here I can see undefined, which means I haven't input any data yet. Let's try doing open source and filtering. And it looks like everything shows open source. And let's also do free tier. And now I've got all platforms that have both, and we'll do this one. Great. So now this is dynamic. And if I re-inspect this URL, I'll be able to see that this value is showing, that's free tier, and this value is not, that's open source. So to recap, we're going to the query builder. We are adding filters and we're giving it a static value like checked or yes or mouse or whatever the value you want to search by is. And then we're taking that, we're copying it here. We're pasting it into our query parameter here, and then we have customized the static values to dynamic by doing the $ brackets and then saying, does this query parameter exist? If yes, then output this. This, by the way, I didn't really mention it. It was just given to us in the query builder. But if you go to your fields, we talked about how we have these field IDs here, but the values also have IDs. So these are my two values I have. This is a select list in Baserow, and I've given it a check and an X. Instead of filtering by check, I'm filtering by its equivalent internal ID, just like we're doing for fields, but these are for values. That way, if later I decide, instead of check, I want to output yes, or is open source, or something like that, I can change that in Baserow and everything will continue working. That's the beauty of disabling the user fields, is that long-term you can not worry about yourself or clients or somebody else changing the column names, the field values. Everything will maintain the references using internal IDs. We have used the filters now. We've taken what the form was putting in the URL and used those query parameters and have conditionally put them into our resource. This, to tie it back to point one, was one of the great points about Baserow, is that we didn't need to specify that else condition. So we just said, does open source exist? Great. Output this value. If it doesn't exist, it's going to output undefined, and Baserow says, I can see you didn't provide anything for this. I'm not going to apply that filter. And that is a great feature, letting us keep our queries or our URLs very simple. So we can check that off, and now we have a full functioning directory, but There's more that you can do with this. You may want to provide visitors the ability to click on one of your directory items and get a detailed listing of more information that's shown on an overview. Kind of like a blog post. You have a blog preview, and then you have the actual blog post. You also may want to make each one of those variations of that page available in the sitemap. So let's talk about that. Heading back over to the marketplace, integrations, Baserow, we first did the directory. This is just a static page, so I can go in here and I can see it's available at /directory. You could change this to whatever you want. But in the marketplace, we also have directory item. If I insert this and inspect this page, it's /directory/ :slug. This means this page will render for /directory/ anything. And what will happen is when somebody goes to /directory/ Baserow, the resource, instead of just always getting a list of all the records, is going to apply a filter and say, only get the record that matches Baserow. That way we have one page, one template, and this will render for every different record we have in Baserow, and it'll have a unique URL per record. And I can test that by going up here. Instead of Baserow, I can test Notion. And you can see in my Baserow, I have a slug column. So I'm saying, okay, I can see that Ghost is in the URL. Get me the slug in Baserow that matches Ghost. And I'm not going to go over this too much, but you actually have all of the pieces pretty much. The one thing we've introduced so far is that we've got :slug here. So we've shown before that there's system.search. We've been using this, but there's also system.params. Params are that slug that we just had there. So I called it slug. Slug shows up. And then Notion is the value, and that's what we changed up here. But this is just to test when you're on your real website, it's whatever's actually in the URL. Then over here, I've got some variables for you to configure as well. I'm saying, what field do you want to filter by? This 263 number is my slug column. So I'm saying I want to filter by this column. And if I open up my query, you don't need to even configure this because it's ready to go. We can see that I'm looking in my search field for the system params.slug. Somebody goes to Ghost, go to Baserow, get me that Ghost record. Now I'll have an individual page per record in Baserow, which begs another question. How is Google going to know about them? Well, let's go back to the integrations here, and in our Baserow, I've got a sitemap here. Sitemap is going to insert a sitemap that fetches your Baserow data. Again, change out these variables. And now you can see I've got directory/coda, directory/notion, and every variation, every row in my Baserow is going to show up in my sitemap. So this is a full-fledged website. I mean, our Baserow is truly a database for our website, and we're pulling in that content and we're making it tightly integrated with our site, showing Google all the different URLs, being able to show a different record per page. And even on our directory, so I can go to one of these and it's going to pull up that information. So we've created our sitemap and our dynamic listing page. I know we've covered a lot in this video. First of all, choosing a tool is very difficult, and that's kind of why I'm making this video, because I built this headless CMS finder so you can go in here and say, okay, I want to open source, free tier, no code setup, and Baserow ends up being the one that works for those three filters. But after we chose a tool, we fetched the data from Baserow, and you can use any API with Webstudio. For Baserow, we went to their API docs, we fetched the data from our Baserow, and then we took all those different data points and mapped them to our different components. So, this is coming from our column platform, for example. After that, we've created our filters, which is really just a form. And when submitting that form, the field names are put into the query parameters, which are accessible in the system variable. After we have those query parameters in the URL, then we added them to our resource. So our resource over here is what's responsible for getting the Baserow data. We're calling a URL. We're passing in these different filters, and that is how we're getting all of the data. And then we've optionally added on a dynamic page, letting this page render for every variation of our slug and being able to pull in and use the same concepts. We're fetching data, we're binding the data. And we've even topped it off with a sitemap displaying all of our URLs, both our static URLs on Webstudio and our dynamic URLs that exist on Baserow. While there are definitely a lot of different concepts to get this working, we've created something very powerful for our visitors. Now, in this real use case, our visitors can go to this page and filter by all the different tools they want. and find exactly what they're looking for. This is great for our visitors. This is great for SEO. And this is a really powerful thing to add to our website. Webstudio and Baserow are two amazing tools that go together, and I hope you build something cool with them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.